So everyone's talking about Christopher Nolan's adaptation of the Odyssey right now, and people are asking whether it will stay true to Homer. Obvious question. Whether it's going to capture the spectacle, right? And whether Nolan is the right director to retell literally one of the greatest stories ever written. But from my perspective, that's actually not the most interesting question. More useful question is this. Did Christopher Nolan change Odysseus, or did he simply recognize that we've changed? Because every generation tells this story differently, right? And it's not because the events change, obviously, but because the questions that matter most to that particular generation or historical epoch, they change. And that's what great stories do, right? They remain remarkably the same while somehow, I'm going to say, continuing to speak to an entirely different generation, different, as I said, historical age. And that makes me wonder, what does the hero we admire reveal about the people that we've become, like where we are today in this world? So when Homer first told his story, one of the central questions was fairly straightforward. Can Odysseus survive long enough to get back home again, right? He had his intelligence, his cunning, his willingness to deceive, his ability to outthink the stronger opponents, right? Those weren't flaws. They were exactly the qualities that people depended on, right? The Trojan horse wasn't simply clever, like it was hugely celebrated. And victory justified ingenuity because survival often depended on being that cunning and that ingenious about things. So if you think about the world that Homer was writing into, war wasn't unusual. It was pretty frequent. Disease was common. Food was not guaranteed. And really, the future was uncertain in ways that I think most people today cannot even begin to imagine. So, of course, people at that time admired the leaders who could project certainty, like that people could rely on, who could make these impossible decisions, and who could really keep their people alive. Their lives literally depended on the abilities of their leaders. But Christopher Nolan isn't making a film for that world, right? He's making one for ours today. And that means that the questions that are going to be asked have to change, right? So today we're less likely to ask, did he win? We're much more likely to ask, what did that winning actually cost him? So it wasn't just the kingdom or the soldiers, but actually him himself as a man. And perhaps an even more interesting question is, does he know what it cost him, right? So I've noticed something over the years, and that is that every generation asks something different of its leaders. Like I've been here a while, and I've seen some changes, and also in the readings I've done of leaders in the past, and we've had some really amazing ones over history, but even the last 100 years, even the last 50 years. So human nature doesn't change, but the conditions that we live in, they change. And so we have different needs of our leaders. The leaders have to show up differently. And as survival becomes a little less uncertain, right? We kind of know what's going to happen tomorrow, more or less. We actually gain the privilege of asking deeper questions. So it's not simply, can this leader succeed? But can this leader live honestly with what that success required, right? So there's accountability in there. Like, can they stand for what it is that they're actually, leading and being in the forefront of? So that question feels very current to me. I mean, look around, right? There's a whole lot of things that are going on in the world, and we absolutely desperately need strong, integrous, courageous, clear, and transparent leadership. Because I don't think that most of us are expecting anybody to be perfect, even our leaders, right? Or anybody, really. So what we do know is that life is complicated, and also most of us know that leadership is super complicated. And we know that difficult decisions have consequences. All decisions do, but the difficult ones, those consequences are even more impactful. So the question isn't whether you've had to make the decisions. The question really becomes, what do you do next? So I've noticed that we often confuse ownership with shame, and they're very different. So shame says, what I did tells me who I am. And ownership says, what I did is true for who I am. And it has consequences. Now what? It's a very different place to stay. That kind of accountability is being willing to stand beside the consequences of the choices that you've made. And in best case scenario, you have that mindset and that intention as you're making the decisions. So ownership is refusing to stand anywhere else but exactly where you've put yourself and where you've chosen to move to. So neither one requires pretending that the past didn't happen, and neither one requires that you have to condemn yourself that it did happen, but they ask you actually to tell your truth to yourself and to others. And I think actually that's what Nolan recognized. So it wasn't that the modern audiences wanted a different Odysseus. I think maybe we're asking a different question. It's not, is our hero victorious, but can our hero carry the truth of his that it took to become victorious? Like, can he stand in his truth and the consequences, the costs that it took for him to have that victory? So, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are. If you leave your comments in the chat box, because when you think about leaders that you admire most, is it their success that earns your respect? Like, what is it? Or is it the way that they carry themselves, or they carry responsibility for the consequences of that success? Because you're in a leadership position, you're going to be making decisions that are often not popular, or they're going to have massive impact, right? Massive consequences. And how can you stand in that? So I genuinely love to hear your thoughts if you want to share them in the comments. And here's what I find most fascinating. I don't think that great adaptations of art, in this case theater, movies, right, modernize the plot. I think they actually modernize the question. They take a question that has been asked for millennia in this case, and they bring it into the current context and frame it in a way that it speaks to who we are today. So for Homer, the journey is largely, can Odysseus survive long enough to return home? Okay? But for Nolan, from my perspective, it seems to have become, can Odysseus return home able to face the man he became along the way? And those are very different journeys, right? One is about the distance, and the other one I'm going to say is about integration. And maybe that's why the Odyssey now has survived for nearly 3,000 years. And I don't think it's because every generation preserves it perfectly the way it was, but because every generation, I'm going to say, puts its own questions inside of it, like frames it in their own context. The events stay familiar, right? But the questions that we're wrestling with, they evolve. And then we hear them, we read them, we see them, we experience them through the story. So the story really becomes a mirror of where we are and who we are. So it's not simply reflecting Odysseus, it's actually reflecting us, right? And I think maybe that's why we keep telling this story, because it gives us the opportunity to see ourselves through the telling of it. And not because Odysseus keeps changing, but because we as humans do. And perhaps the greatest stories endure because they continue asking the questions that we're now ready to hear, right? They keep us at that edge of living into and from the questions rather than just the answers. Something to think about. So if this perspective gave you a different way of thinking about the Odyssey or leadership or even storytelling and the ones that we admire or engage with this way, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to the channel, join our community, and leave comments below about your thoughts. Each week we explore, I'm going to say, the deeper human patterns that are beneath the headlines and the films and the books and the cultural moments really that capture our attention as human beings today. Because I think often that biggest story is not the one that we're paying attention to. There's one underneath that, and that's the one that's really juicy. It's the one that really tells us something about ourselves. All right. Thanks for being here, and until next time, be well.